General MacArthur tossed from side to side. Sleep would not come to him. In the darkness, he kept seeing Arthur Rickman's face. He'd like Arthur. He'd been damned fond of Arthur. He'd been pleased that Leslie liked him too. Leslie was so capricious. Lots of good fellows that Leslie would turn up her nose at and pronounce dull. Dull, just like that. But she hadn't found Arthur Rickmond dull. They'd got on well together from the very beginning. They'd talk of plays and music and pictures together. She teased him, made fun of him, ragged him, and he, MacArthur, had been delighted at the thought that Leslie took quite a motherly interest in the boy. Motherly indeed. Damn fool not to remember that Rickmond was 28 to Leslie's 29. He'd loved Leslie. He could see her now, her heart-shaped face and her dancing deep grey eyes, and the brown curling mass of her hair. He'd loved Leslie, and he'd believed in her absolutely. Out there in France, in the middle of all the hell of it, he'd sat thinking of her, taken her picture out of the breast pocket of his tunic, and then he'd found out. It had come about exactly in the way things happened in the box, the letter in the wrong envelope. She'd been writing to them both, and she'd put her letter to recommend in the envelope addressed to her husband. Even now, all these years after, he could feel the shock of it, the pain. God, it had hurt. And the business had been going on some time. The letter made that clear. Weekends, recommends last leave. Leslie, and Arthur. God damn the fellow. Damn his smiling face, his brisk, yes sir, liar and hypocrite, stealer of another man's wife. He had gathered slowly that cold, murderous rage. He'd managed to carry on as usual, to show nothing. He tried to make his manner to recommend just the same. Had he succeeded? He thought so. Recommend hadn't suspected. Inequalities of temper was easily accounted for out there, where men's nerves were continually snapping under the strain. Only young Armitage had looked at him curiously once or twice. Quite a young chap, but he'd had perceptions, that boy. Armitage, perhaps, had guessed when the time came. He'd sent Rickmond deliberately to death. Only a miracle could have brought him through unhurt. That miracle didn't happen. Yes, he'd sent Rickmond to his death, and he wasn't sorry. It had been easy enough. Mistakes were being made all the time. Officers being sent to death needlessly. All was confusion, panic. People might say afterwards, old MacArthur lost his nerve a bit, made some colossal blunders, sacrificed some of his best men. They couldn't say more. But young Armitage was different. He'd looked at his commanding officer very oddly. He'd known, perhaps, that Rickmond was being deliberately sent to death. After the war was over, had Armitage talked? Leslie hadn't known. Leslie had wept for her lover, he supposed, but her weeping was over by the time he'd come back to England. He'd never told her that he'd find her out. They'd gone on together. Only, somehow, she hadn't seemed very real anymore. And then, 3 or 4 years later, she'd got double pneumonia and died. That had been a long time ago. 15 years, 16 years. And he'd left the army and come to live in Devon. Bought the sort of little place he'd always meant to have. Nice neighbors, pleasant part of the world. There was a bit of shooting and fishing. He'd gone to church on Sundays, but not the day that the lesson was read about David putting Uriah in forefront of the battle. Somehow he couldn't face that. Gave him an uncomfortable feeling. Everybody had been very friendly at first. That is, later he had had an uneasy feeling that people were talking about him behind his back. They eyed him differently, somehow, as though they had heard something, some lying rumor. Armitage. Supposing Armitage had talked, he'd avoided people after that, withdrawn into himself, unpleasant to feel that people were discussing you. And all so long ago, so purposeless now. Leslie had faded into the distance, and Arthur recommended too. Nothing of what had happened seemed to matter any more. It made life lonely, though. He'd taken to shunning his old army friends. If Armitage had talked, they'd never know about it. And now, this evening, a hidden voice had played out that old hidden story. Had he dealt with it all right, keep a stiff upper lip, betrayed the right amount of feeling, indignation, disgust, but no guilt, no discomfiture. Difficult to tell. Surely nobody could have taken the accusation seriously. There had been a pack of other nonsense just as far-fetched. That charming girl, the voice had accused her of drowning a child. Idiotic. Some madman throwing crazy accusations about. Emily Brent, too, actually a niece of old Tom Brent of the regiment, it had accused her of murder. Anyone could see with half an eye that the woman was as pious as could be, the kind that was hand and glove with Parsons. Damned curious business, the whole thing. Crazy, nothing less. Ever since they had got here. When was that? Why, damn it, it was only this afternoon. Seemed a good bit longer than that. He thought, I wonder when we shall get away again. Tomorrow, of course, when the motorboat came from the mainland. Funny, just this minute he didn't want much to get away from the island, to go back to the mainland, back to his little house, back to all troubles and worries. Through the open window he could hear the waves breaking on the rocks, a little louder now than earlier in the evening. Wind was getting up, too, he thought. Peaceful sound, peaceful place, he thought. Best of an island is once you get clear, you can't go any farther. You have come to the end of things. He knew. Suddenly, he didn't want to leave the island.